Chinese President Xi Jinping is embarking on a multinational tour of Middle Eastern and African countries ahead of his attendance at the BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. His first stop will be the UAE, followed by Senegal, Rwanda, and lastly, South Africa. What do Sino-Emirati relations forestall for the Middle East, and how is sub-Saharan Africa increasing in importance for China? And why Mauritius? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Hua Liming, former Chinese ambassador to the UAE, Hannah Ryder, the founder and CEO of Development Reimagined, and by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. We shall also be joined via satellite from Los Angeles by Fazam Kalamabadi, President and Chairman of Future Trends Group. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray.
As a gateway between the East and West, the United Arab Emirates' geographical location makes it the ideal hub in China's revived ancient Silk Road plan. The UAE's Minister of Economy says the country will actively participate in the program. It hopes to find more opportunities for cooperation with China as Arab nation diversifies economic structure.
One of the areas that I would like to focus on is the area of innovation as the UAE moves on the diversity of the economy with a target of about 5% contribution of innovation into the GDP. And of course that will require quite a chain system of development in many other areas. One of it is R&D, and if we can also connect to the R&D system at the university level and other areas in China, because that is something that we need to learn from the Chinese model.
The UAE is one of the founding members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the China-initiated multilateral development bank which aims to provide funding for vital infrastructure projects throughout Asia. Last year, bilateral trade stood at $41 billion, making China one of the UAE's top trading partners. Investment areas span a wide range, with oil and gas, clean energy, finance and infrastructure topping the list. More than 1 million Chinese visited the UAE last year. The two countries now have a mutual visa exemption. President Xi Jinping's trip to the UAE is the first by a Chinese head of state in 29 years. The Chinese ambassador to the UAE, Ni Jian, said it's of political, historic and strategic significance for bilateral relations. After his trip to the UAE, President Xi will go on to Africa with stops in Senegal, Rwanda and South Africa. Xi Jinping will also attend the 10th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg. The Chinese Foreign Ministry official says the summit will deal with the challenges posed by recent policy changes in Western developed countries. It's widely expected that at the summit, President Xi will urge the emerging economies to join forces against the U.S. tariffs.
Welcome to Dialogue. No one questions the message that President Xi Jinping delivers to the rest of the world through this tour that will take him to 5 nations, particularly the China-Arab relationship. But UAE is an important member of GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council. What do you think of the issues on the agenda between the two governments in the broad context of our relationship with the Middle East in particular?
Yes, this will be the first visit of Chinese president after the 19th Congress of Chinese Communist Party to Middle East, to a Middle East country, and also first visit of Chinese president after 29 years. So I think this will be a very important visit, and shows the special position of the UAE Emirates in Chinese foreign policy.
And why do you think Senegal, Rwanda appear on the agenda of President Xi Jinping for this tour? And what's special about these two African countries?
Well, they are very interesting because they're typically thought to be very small and don't get much attention internationally. But what's interesting...
Except for what happened during the massacre in Rwanda in the early 1990s, I'm afraid.
Part of the problem was that Rwanda didn't get enough international support at that time. But now Rwanda is a growing country, Senegal too. They're really trying to improve their economies. Rwanda is the most efficient economy after Mauritius in terms of doing business. Senegal is getting even better, getting more investment. And I think China sees Senegal as very strategic. It's the port of Dakar is in a very strategic investment central location between Europe, North America, and elsewhere, and even into Africa. So, and is one of the most the best ports in the world across West Africa. So it is a very important place for investing.
Are you sure these two countries in Africa are an important part of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, in the area of infrastructure building?
Yes. Well, so far these countries have not been part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is coming up in September, and what it will do is bring the whole African continent under the Belt and Road Initiative. So there'll be an opportunity for both the countries, aside from just these visits and the bilateral relationship, to also be part of the Belt and Road Initiative to increase the better relationship with China. In fact, there's already a lot going on with Chinese investors there. You see, I work a lot with the Made in Africa initiative, who is supporting Rwanda to build an industrial park, a new industrial park, designed especially for Chinese investors to visit there. And similarly, also Senegal, they're bringing in an investor for investing in the textile industry. So there's a range of a lot of activity in those countries already with Chinese, and it's great that President Xi is going to effectively go there and bring more prominence to these countries.
First of all, congratulations on the remarkable progress in the national reconciliation following the civil strife between Hutus and Tutsis back in 1994 in Rwanda. Now, the formidable presence of the Chinese investment and business communities in Africa have always made headlines for Western media. Why do you think our presence there has caused so much curiosity for the Western observers?
Well, first of all, I think it's a symptom of sour grape. Many European countries, Western countries, have neglected Africa, and Africa for many decades was called the forgotten continent. And China, for all these years, ever since the end of the 1950s, has always been consistent in engaging with Africa, treating all African countries, big and small, as brothers and sisters, and more recently investing heavily in Africa. I would say the recent revival of Africa is very much due to the consistent and continued engagement of China politically as well as economically with Africa, and this actually caused some of the Western European countries or other Western countries a kind of revengeful, or they want to make some opinions or do some actions to sour the relations between China and the African countries. Now, one thing I can emphasize, and I can be a witness to that, whenever I go to Africa, whenever I see an African, I always treat him or her as my brother and sister. And this is very different from when I go to Europe or America, for example. I have many friends in many other parts of the world, but I do not automatically treat them as my brothers and sisters. So I would urge the Western friends to really look at the quality of the relations between China and the African countries and focus on the big things that China is doing in terms of national building, helping the African countries in doing the national building, and also in rolling out infrastructure which enables their economic development.
Victor says a lot about the brotherhood and the friendship. What's behind this special relationship? Is that because of our shared memories about colonialism, a similar roadmap of developing countries, emerging markets like South Africa? What is it that drives the relationship between African countries, particularly those in the sub-Saharan region, and China?
Just look at the identities, common identities of China and the African countries. One identity is China is a developing country, the African country too. Of course, the second is China is a socialist country. When a socialist country, it treated all African countries equally, and China doesn't seek any sphere of influence, and China doesn't have a proxy in that continent. So this is the second identity. The third, China is an Oriental country. I think that these are three identities of China makes China very close to African countries, of course, as well as to the Emirates.
Now,
of course, I just want to remind one thing. Rwanda is the current chair country of African Union.
Correct.
And Senegal is the next venue of China-African Summit. So maybe this is one of the reasons that these two countries have been chosen.
Hannah,
Yes.
I went to Johannesburg to cover the China-Africa Dialogue Summit.
Yes, me too.
And I was impressed by the 10-point proposal that President Xi Jinping delivered at the opening ceremony. The bulk of the suggestions, I'm afraid, focus on industrialization of the African continent. That's massive, mega projects in many ways. So, do you think China can live up to the expectations of African leaders?
Well, you're right, there are a lot of expectations, a lot of needs. Industrialization is a very, very big priority for African countries. And the majority, and it's also been recognized in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as well as something very important for progress. And it's obvious that Chinese stakeholders are helping African countries, many African countries, a lot with the industrialization. That said, there is still even more to do, and I hope that when the next forum on China-Africa cooperation comes up in September here in Beijing, that many of these issues will be addressed. There's even more needs for financing for infrastructure across the continent. That will make the industrialization even a better business case. You know, a country like Rwanda is landlocked, so it's very expensive. It costs more for some goods to be transported to the port in Mombasa as it costs for Shanghai to Mombasa, which is just incredible. So more needs for infrastructure, more needs for industrialization support, and at the same time, what the industrialization should also help with is improving the trade balance between African countries and other nations, including China. Right now, the trade balance with China for many African countries is not good enough, and particularly for countries that don't have many natural resources. They really need to find ways of improving their trade and exports to China. China's a great market.
A small number of the African countries may not have sufficient resources. However, for others, they may suffer, ironically, the resource curse, given the downward pressure of the prices. And let me cross over to Mr. Kazan Kamlabandi, leader of Future Trends Group. And he's, in fact, an old friend of Dialogue, and he often appears on my program making comments on Middle East issues. Hello, Fazan. Long time no see. But first of all, we have a consistent concern when it comes to China's investment in developing countries for the building of infrastructure, because there's the alleged debt trap, meaning like the cancellation of a high-speed project in Malaysia. The newly elected leader, Dr. Mahathir, said his predecessor was involved in a corruption scandal, and this country, Malaysia, cannot afford to make such a hefty investment in the building of a high-speed railway in this small country. Do you think other developing countries share much of the same concern about the alleged debt trap?
Yes, in general, the relationship of China to the whole Middle East and Africa is a long-term thing, and the need is always there. As you said, the political stability of the country and also the national will of not only the people, not only the enterprises, but the government, and the debt-related issues, the ability to pay back, and the relationship does often change from time to time, but it is not a blockage. At the end, China is active in investing abroad. It's just how much the volume can increase. And as you know, the African countries, there are 54 countries, and the whole of the Arab League are 22 countries. So you put it aggregate together, it is like twice the size of US. And so it is really interplay of China's not entering, because China is already there, but how large of a trade and investment share, basket share, China can catch. Of course, it's mutual. It's the receiving end, and their need and their national will also matters.
When King of Saudi Arabia came over, Victor and me share the wonderful memories about their friendly visit to the PRC the year before last. They delivered the vision of 2030 vision, right? The 2030 vision, or industrialization of Saudi Arabia. But A, first of all, they don't have enough labor force. And B, industrialization involves a lot of things that this Middle East kingdom cannot afford to have. What do you think of the difficulties?
Well, I think Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 overlaps with what China is proposing.
By mentioning Saudi Arabia, by extension, I mean Arab countries as well as most of the African countries. They have the same problem.
Yeah, if we look at Vision 2030 by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and what China is promoting for the One Belt One Road, there is a lot of overlap. This is exactly why the kingdom is so excited. And Her Majesty the King, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, have all emphasized the importance of promoting the coordination between the One Belt One Road initiative on the one hand and the Vision 2030. And I think it applies to many other countries in the Middle East, especially the Arab countries. Yes, indeed, the population is a problem, labor force is a problem, but Saudi Arabia actually has the largest population in the Arab countries other than Egypt, 35 million people. That's a lot. And also I think what they plan is that once industrialization builds up, they can import labor from many other countries, like Pakistan, like Indonesia, for example. So I don't think labor or shortage of labor itself is a hindrance. I think it really requires a lot of good overall macro planning and identify the resources. And this is exactly why I think a lot of people in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are coming to China, because they find a natural fit between what China can offer and what can really help achieve industrialization by the kingdom. And I'm very much involved in this, and I have many friends in Saudi Arabia. We work very, very long hours on many occasions trying to promote more cooperation between China and the kingdom for the industrialization. And I'm sure between China and UAE there are other cooperations. And I remember I even called up the ambassador some time ago, tried to pick his brain on one major project involving UAE. And such incidents in the future probably will be more than whatever we have already encountered up to now.
Well, in both cases we have the same problem. We should not interfere with the internal affairs of either Arab countries or African nations. And for example, Premier Zhou Enlai, our late Premier, said famously, we should not offend a single member of the 22-member Arab League. We also rely on the African Union for their own internal coordination in the domain of foreign policy. So what do you think of China's traditional policy of non-interference? Do you think this policy has been undergoing quite changes as our global stakes are increasingly scattered throughout the whole world?
Middle East is one of the areas in the world that has big potentiality. But unfortunately, Middle East have so many problems, so many confrontations, and unfortunately 2 wars are still going on in the Middle East. And among the Middle East countries, between themselves, they have many hostilities, animosities among themselves. But one of China's advantages in the Middle East, that China has never involved in those confrontations, and China never takes side in all the problems within the Middle East.
The issue, excuse me, Ambassador Hua, is since we remain relatively detached from the proxy wars, we never seek to have a sphere of influence, then we should be very popular with almost every and each member state of the GCC or the Middle East bloc. So why have we failed to send a very authoritative special envoy to help negotiate the peace process, a chronic issue between Israel and Arab states?
China has appointed a special envoy.
We do have a special envoy, but it seems, we cannot play the role that the United States did, like during the years of Richard Nixon, shuttle diplomacy by Dr. Henry Kissinger.
Yes, you're right. If you look at the history, China has never been a player in the Middle East area. So this, you may say this is a disadvantage of China, but I would say this is an advantage of China.
Disadvantage or advantage?
Advantage, because unlike other big powers, China has never involved in the problems. And it used to be said the Middle East is the graveyard of big powers. China has never been in this, the player.
But the counter-argument, Ambassador Hua, Victor, and if you like, Hannah, is that without some kind of interference, like what the United States practices in its global policy, you won't effectively exert global influence. Will you?
If you do not mind, let me disagree with your proposition a little bit. Why? Let me say, China probably is the only major country which has never been involved in aiding one country in the Arab world against another. And therefore, this kind of impartiality really is helpful. And I think China has built up a track record over many decades that China does not involve in a war or conflict involving Arab countries or other Muslim countries. For example, when Iran-Iraq war lasted for 8 years, China was not aiding one country against the other or otherwise. The American leaders in the 1980s, and I was doing the interpretation at that time, coming to Beijing urging the Chinese government to support Iraq and Saddam Hussein to fight against Iran and Ayatollah Khomeini. Deng Xiaoping said, no, that's not China will do. China will keep equal distance with both Iraq as well as Iran. And in subsequent wars and conflicts, China is doing the same thing. Whereas, for example, if you look at some other big power, they support one country to fight another, and then they support the other country to fight another. Some of the problems we have in the Middle East are a direct result of the interference by some major power in the Middle East.
Thank you very much. Let me cross over to Kazan. Hello. We've been discussing China's foreign policy. You know, during the Cold War, China allegedly assisted with the Americans in fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. And we've been talking to moderates of the Taliban, according to Western media reports. And we've been talking to, we invite some of the opposition forces modest in their position against the Syrian government and brought them to Beijing for negotiations about the peaceful prospects in this war-torn country of Syria. Now, given these Western allegations, what do you think of the Chinese foreign policy in the Middle East, a volatile region?
Yes, I think Chinese both political and military involvement wants to keep it always at the minimum, and that is actually correct at this time because these conflicts are so deep-rooted and have so much historic, cultural, religious, and political and economic issues that at this time it is not solvable. If you don't add to the trouble, already is good. So China's stance that in politics and in military I don't get involved. However, in economic, I get involved heavily, and that I think is a correct policy. After all, it is about business, and it is about now not a physical war, what we call it a trade war or a trade more affluent, mutually beneficial cooperation.
Now, Kazan, excuse me.
China acts more.
Excuse me, Kazan. Let me give you 3 examples to illustrate the embarrassment and dilemma of China in the host countries like Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. In all cases, the mega projects came to a halt due to the domestic bipartisan wrangling. Now, Dr. Mahathir accused his predecessor Najib of being involved in the corruption, and the opposition party overthrew the Sri Lanka government. The head I interviewed, I forget his name, over the construction of a Hambantota port, the logistics in particular. In Myanmar, the Mizong Dam. I mean, these stories present a gruesome picture about casualty of the Chinese investment. If you do nothing to persuade both sides, protect our business stakes, then you're going to suffer heavily. So the counter-argument, I'm afraid, may be growing quietly in China. Look, we may somehow reconsider our traditional policy of non-interference. What do you think of such a public debate?
I think the idea of more involvement as far as influence is correct. But you cannot really influence to the level of control inside the country. These at this time the whole world is progressing on top of instabilities. That means you cannot have perfect stability and do business. If you, within instabilities, conduct business, that means it's a large region. You select your players, which country is more stable, which country is long-term, and there is much room to grow. Actually, the whole point is that China initiated the new Silk Road, because I was involved in this process. However, China itself is slow in implementing that. India moved forward faster, and Russia moved forward faster, and in fact, America moved forward more. So it is a matter of more proactive involvement, first in investment, infrastructure, and trade, and of course cultural relations and political relations in countries where they are stable. And so it is really a know-how. You need to predict which country is your long-term ally, which country the change of the government does not affect your continued progress of economic cooperation. That's why UAE is a very good example of a country whose national will itself is very solid. And it's not only UAE itself. UAE is a corridor to over 120 other countries. So China needs what I call centers or capitals for the new Silk Road. For example, the capital of finance, the capital of trade, and China's outbound investment, but also external trade. So if you want to reduce your trade relations with the West, then where do you replace? Because China has 1.5 billion and about tens of millions of industry factories. You need to place for them jobs. You need to have your product placed. So the second transfer of technology, that means taking Chinese, not just product selling, but establishing industrial zones in the developing countries of the western side of China, is the right policy.
Thank you very much,
regardless
Kazan.
of the instabilities.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
Yeah.
This tour will take President Xi Jinping to South Africa, where he's going to attend the BRICS Summit. Now, South Africa seems to be trailing behind Nigeria in its economic development. I'm not talking about their internal political reshuffle. Jack Zuma, former president, was brought down on charges of corruption. That's not our focus of the discussion here. I'm talking about why South Africa, which used to prosper among all other underdeveloped countries in this continent, failed to live up to our expectations despite the end of apartheid in the early 1990s.
Well, South Africa is still the biggest recipient of Chinese investment and also the biggest, one of the biggest economies in Africa. It is moving slowly, it's growing slowly. The same with Nigeria, is also growing slowly because of the problems with having not diversified out of oil, and for South Africa it's a similar issue. So again, industrialization has to be the answer, diversification has to be the answer. But I want to just mention something, coming back to the previous conversation about the non-interference. I believe it's going to be harder and harder to have this position, and in particular because of the increasing economic ties. You know, Africa is still, whether we're talking about large economies like South Africa or Nigeria, Africa is still only 2% of Chinese trade, you know. So the economic impact of African relations and changes within Africa, whatever you want to call stable or not stable, you know, there is no one definition. You really need to know the specifics of each country. Still, China needs to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you so much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on President Xi Jinping's recent tour, ongoing tour of countries in the Middle East as well as Africa. Industrialization of this continent remains a silver lining for the improvement of the livelihoods for Africans in their millions. But whether the digital technology will help or be counterproductive, that's the topic for our next discussion. I'll see you until then. Goodbye.